So I think the lead question might be, do you remember where you were? Do you remember what stage of life you're at when you had that realization of who you are matters? Do you remember that aha moment when it just occurred to you that there's a lot of things in life you don't control? The one thing you do control is your essence, your character. I wasn't that long ago, frankly. I think I was probably in my mid-20s, and I was actually listening to a podcast from Dave Ramsey. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's kind of a big deal. And he was telling this story in which he was in a drugstore, and he had paid for whatever it is he had purchased. And when the clerk gave him his change, this was back when cash was a thing, when the clerk gave him his change, he realized that she gave him the wrong change. And what should have been a $1 bill was a $20 bill. And you just have to trust, it wasn't as braggadocious as it sounds, I think, when I tell the story now, but the way he said it is he said, I realized in that moment that I had to decide whether or not my character was worth more than $20. And he went on to say, I made this conscious decision in that moment that I wasn't going to sell my character for what amounted to really $19. And for whatever reason, that just, maybe it was because I was a new dad, maybe because I had been several years into marriage and I wasn't very good at it, maybe because I'd been trying to follow Jesus for half a decade and was still trying to make sense of what that meant. But I do remember there was this sense of like, whoa, that makes some sense. That who I am is ultimately the prize. And part of my reluctance with this series, quite frankly, in the kind of final moments, was so much of what COVID's done to me is just kind of expose some of the individual narcissism that's so prevalent in, I know, my worldview, and having this higher appreciation for it's really not about me, but about people and community and relationship and generations and tradition. And so I think part of what I want to say is it's not only this realization that character is like your prize, but it's ultimately the gift that you have to offer. And I think part of the goal of this series here is to try to just shine some light on some things we already know and maybe bring some attention to some areas that we've been meaning to get to. It wasn't long after that I heard Dallas Willard. He made a statement that was something like, what we get from this life is who we become. What God gets from our life is who we become, which would mean that what our friends get from our life is who we become. And listen, I'm not the exemplar of human character. Probably all of us in this room have the same thing in common. Not probably, we all have this in common, and that is the further away you get from me, the better you look. The closer you get, the more difficult it is. I think talking about character in context when you're sitting next to your roommate or your mom or your spouse, it's tricky because we know the worst of one another in many cases. But what if Dallas is onto something? And I think for me, the reason why I wanted to bring this series now was there's this realization of, I don't know about you, but COVID's taken some things. It seems like they're starting to return, like maybe even this morning. But COVID's taken some things that probably most of us, especially those of us who maybe have never been to war or never seen a lot of the third world, or frankly are more like 20 or 30 or 40 versus having seen other eras of human history. It's taken things that we legitimately didn't think could be taken from us. I mean, it sounds trivial, but to me, it's crazy to think the NCAA Final Four tournament was canceled last March. At the time, that just made no sense. The Olympics canceled, school canceled, many of your businesses completely put on hold. Suddenly air travel, at some point I think it's going to begin to set into us like everything that we lost. But part of, I think, the opportunity of COVID is this realization that whole time you were still stuck with you. And that whole time it was this deep reminder that what Christian tradition has said for 2,000 years and Judeo-Christian for longer than that is this notion that when we die, some divine being waves a wand over us, and the extent to which there's an afterlife, we become the right kind of person. That's not the Jesus story. That the Jesus story, and I know we get caught up in these conversations of heaven and hell and who goes and who doesn't. The Jesus story is ultimately a God who, starting with the cross, but it's also the God who wants to transform us now. And so I guess my hope here in this series is not to in any way say that I'm the exemplar or that you are or that any of us feel like we get A+ in this, but just to maybe capture the moment of the season and go, this is an invitation to really think about the kind of tombstone virtues, you might call it, the stuff that really matters. Now, one of the gifts to me in this season was rediscovering the work of a guy named David Brooks. And I recognize for some of you, David Brooks might be politics signaling, and you'll just have to trust that it's not that for me. I discovered David Brooks long after his great political savvy had kind of been set aside. If you're not familiar, David Brooks has been for years and built quite a profession, quite a career, being a conservative columnist for, I think it's the New York Times. And I jokingly heard him say at a lecture given at BYU in 2019, he said, which kind of makes him the head rabbi at Mecca, which I think is funny. But his point is that he's been a voice for conservative politics for a long time, but what's happened to him in about the last 5 to 10 years is he's become pretty disillusioned with the whole scene. He began to recognize, the way I heard him say it in another lecture more recently, is he has this grave concern that we're in a culture that's replaced politics or morality with politics. That in ways where we used to judge one another for our moral conviction, today we judge one another for our political stances. And so in many ways, he's separated himself from the political scene. I understand he still has a voice, but he started his own deep work. And for me, I bumped into him initially by reading this book called The Second Mountain. It's probably the best book I read in 2020. We'll do a series from it in the fall, I think. But having been impacted by that book, I worked backwards and re-picked up a book that he wrote about 5 years prior to that called The Road to Character. And it's in there where he begins what you now see as a very personal journey for him of this realization of ultimately what we get from this life is who we become. Now, one of the real inspiring parts of the book, it's a very odd book, to be honest with you. It starts fast, it's engaging, and then it follows several biographies of people, and you kind of wonder what you're doing. And if you don't finish the book, you don't get it. So the first time I read it several years ago, I didn't finish it because you just get bogged down in these somewhat engaging biographies. I re-picked it up, and in the opening chapters, he talks about a particular Jewish rabbi from the mid-20th century who developed these lenses for viewing Scripture. And I don't even know to what extent I connect with the actual study that he did, but the point, I think, the metaphor of it is beautiful. See, what he observes is what scholars have observed for a long time, that the first chapter of the Bible and the second chapter of the Bible seem to be two different stories. Not contradictory so much as it's almost like they took two different stories and went, we want them both. Because the Adam, the person, and you'll have to, it's very gender-specific language, and I apologize, just trust me. Well, I guess I just have a bias for the name Adam. But if we just allow, like he's talking about humanity, but we're talking about a guy who did his work in the 1950s, and rather than kind of stumble over making it more gender neutral, what he says is that Adam 1 shows up in Genesis 1, and that Adam 1 is about ego. It's about accomplishment. That version of humanity is about creating things and discovering things and making things happen. But in Genesis 2, you get a different kind of Adam, what he calls Adam 2. Not perhaps the most creative phrasing, but in Genesis 2, you have Adam 2, and he says Adam 2 is more about moral character. Less about individualism, more about community. Less about what do I get, more about what do I give. And the part of his hermeneutic, I guess, the part of his study that I love is he suggests both Adams have value. That Adam 1 has a place, and Adam 2 has a place, and in some ways what he says is Genesis 1 and 2, it kind of summarizes the human experience. That we all have to navigate this great tension between our Adam 1 self and our Adam 2 self. Now, where that gets interesting to me is, as he points out, how do you strengthen your Adam 1 self? I mean, how do you develop that part of you? Well, you identify strengths and you make them stronger, right? And this to me is a reminder of Marcus Buckingham's work, where he reminds us that our strengths are not necessarily just the things we're good at, they're the things that we're willing to work hard at. And there is a difference. It's possible to be good at something but not enjoy working hard at it, which brings in mind the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000-hour rule. But really our strengths are those things that we enjoy enough, we're good enough at them rather, but we also enjoy working hard at them. No matter what sector you're in, whether it's teaching or architecture or the military, whatever it is, you probably have this sense of like, I've been next to people in my sector who were naturally better at it than me. They just didn't enjoy it as much as I do, so here I still am. So if we build our Adam 1 self by building our strengths, well then how do we build our Adam 2 self? And this, I think, is really uncomfortable in our culture. It's probably has a lot to do with the psychology that's driven us for the last several decades, because what he would say, this rabbi, is you build your Adam 2 self by identifying your weaknesses and going to war against them. And where David Brooks' work really grabbed my attention, because in my opinion it does complement the way the Spirit of God moves in the historic movement that's represented in the church and the text, is what he suggests is that in eras beyond our own, prior to our own rather, people had a greater sense of what their greatest moral flaws would be. And they woke up in the morning with a concerted effort to go to war against those flaws. Now, I suspect he's a little bit guilty of nostalgia. I don't think that people of other eras were probably any better than us, but they were, in a sense, less individualistic. And so it raises this question of what does that look like? What does it look like to identify our core issues and go to war against them? You may be familiar with the Jesus temptation story, something that I haven't decided yet what we're going to talk about next week or in April when we do a series from the Gospel of Matthew. But there's this sense in Jesus' temptations that perhaps what's going on is evil knew exactly what buttons to push for Jesus. And whether it's representative of humanity, which seems likely, or it's representative of Jesus specifically, which also seems likely, it seems to point to this story that maybe your weaknesses aren't as random as you think. That maybe you and I, if we could draw a line through our weaknesses, we would see a pretty strong theme. In his book, he tells the story of Dwight Eisenhower. And that from an early age, Dwight Eisenhower seemed to have understood, not seemed to, did understand that his temper was his chief moral weakness. David Brooks tells what he says is a key story from his early years. I don't know whether he's 6, 7, 8 years old. His older siblings were told they could go trick-or-treating. Dwight was told he could not. In a moment, probably all of us can recognize or appreciate, he lost his temper, he ran out into the front yard, and just proceeded to repeatedly punch the family apple tree. The result, of course, wasn't pretty, either emotionally or physically. His hands were bloodied. Eventually, as which happens when we embarrass ourselves in those kinds of lack of emotional self-control moments, he retreated to a private space, which was his bedroom. He laid on his bed and wept. Eventually, his mom, Ida, came to him. She began to soothe him and bandage his hands. And then she quoted to him from Proverbs 16:32. And she said, which says, it's a good thing I got that ribbon in my Bible, huh? One who is slow to anger is better than the mighty. The one whose temper is controlled than one who captures a city. As a mother, she had already identified that his chief moral issue would be his temper. And those who study his life say that for the rest of his life, including when he was the commander of the Allied forces of Europe, including when he was the president of the United States, he had this full understanding that his undoing would be his anger. He was aware of it. He went to war against it every day. Which to me raises this question. Do we see that theme represented in this story? The story of people chasing after God and God people, the story that I think is a gift from God in ways that I don't fully understand. Do we see this sense of God like identifying for people identifying to God these chief issues and battling them? I can't help but think of a guy named Moses. Those of you who know the story will know that, there's this familiar tale. He committed murder. He thought he was the guy. But Stephen in the book of Acts does something unique with Moses' story. It seems that he pulls from the Jewish oral tradition when he begins to talk about that when Moses, who was raised in Egypt but wasn't an Egyptian and ultimately became aware of the Israelites' plight, he thought to himself, I'm their guy. He committed murder thinking he would start a revolution, and that backfired. And the sense of we're starting a revolution is new. And let me just read it to you from Acts, because I think it's this fascinating realization of, whoa, what is Stephen doing here? When he, speaking of Moses, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his relatives, the Israelites. When he saw one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He supposed that his kinfolk, in my opinion, here's kind of Stephen introducing parts that really aren't there explicitly in Exodus. He supposed that his kinsfolk would understand that God through him was rescuing them, but they did not understand. The next day he came to some of them as they were quarreling and tried to reconcile them, saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you wrong each other?" But the man who was wronging the neighbor pushed Moses aside, saying, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When he heard this, Moses, he fled the scene. He became a resident alien in the land of Midian. There he became the father of 2 sons. Now, it's an argument from silence, but where did Moses get this idea that this would work? No evidence yet that God had given him that idea. And in fact, 40 years later, having spent 40 years in the desert, God does show up to Moses and says, "Hey, I'm going to go do this thing." And in my opinion, Moses uttered words that he would have never uttered at 40 years old. His Adam 2 self wasn't ready for it. Moses said, "Who am I? I can't do this." And God seems to say, "Exactly, which is why you're ready. I'll do this." What if the desert was as much about Moses being awakened to his Adam 2 self? Which ought to come as some kind of encouragement, I think, because if the great Moses didn't really figure that out until he was into his 40s, then maybe there's hope for people like me and you. But here's where it gets interesting. In the book of Numbers, because I guess what I'm suggesting is, what if Moses' chief issue was arrogance, self-assurance? What if he was a bit haughty, if you know what I mean? Now that would be interesting because it seems to reflect that behavior, but then in Numbers, a book that on some level is attributed to him, listen to what Numbers 3 says. "Now the man Moses was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth." It's a tricky thing, isn't it? Because on the one hand, it's like, you are arrogant, especially if you wrote that. But it may also speak to this idea of here's this great icon of the faith who there's a story, and the story is he was flawed and broken to his core. And maybe Numbers is as much a tribute to him and to the work of God in him as it is something that came easy to him. Or I think of Saul and David. Now this one's tricky. If you're familiar with the first and second king of Israel, here's the question that occurred to me in all of this. Did Saul lose? Did David win? Here's what I mean by that. Saul, the first king of Israel, he started fast. In fact, if you go to 1 Samuel, the anointing of Saul as king, there's 2 things that go on here. First, there's this great triumphant, like, you're the guy. But notice also the vocational call. Samuel took a vial of oil and poured it on his head. This is Saul. This is like inauguration day. And he kissed him. And he said, "The Lord has anointed you ruler over his people Israel. You shall reign," listen to the privilege, "over the people of the Lord. But watch this, and you will save them from the hand of their enemies all around." Now, if you've never read the story of Saul, and maybe you've never read the Bible, 1 Samuel 10 through 15 would be a great place to start because it's an epic tale of tragedy. Someone who started with great promise, who repeatedly loses his sense of vocation, completely loses sight of any kind of moral responsibility to God or anyone else. The culminating piece in my mind is when the guy named Goliath is shouting for Saul to come, he's fighting for Israel to come fight him. And the deal Goliath makes is, send me your best, we'll go one-on-one, and a winner takes all kind of battle. Now historians would look at that and go, that was Saul's job. Saul needs to go fight Goliath. He's the king. Instead, what does he do? He gets a little shepherd boy named David, and actually some commentators suggest that when he offers his armor to David, what he's really doing to David is go, "Here, you wear my clothes so people will think it's me, but it's not really me, and so it's win-win. If you win, I win. If you lose, ta-da, I'm still here." But the end story of Saul is one of tragedy. His kingship is ripped from him. But this is where, for me, it gets messy because then there's David. David, I don't know, I suppose if you're counting flaws, at least as recorded in the Bible, it seems like he can match every one of them to Saul. He commits adultery. He then arranges for the murder of the spouse of the person he commits adultery with. Frankly, he doesn't seem to be a particularly good father. Like, David makes mistake after mistake after mistake, but here's my reflection, and we all get to pay our fee and make our choice, but what if Saul lost? Not because he was imperfect, but because he wasn't engaged in his Adam 2 self. What if David won? Because what's the refrain of David over and over and over in the text? He's a man after God's own heart. He's a man, but what does that mean? I mean, it doesn't prevent him from committing adultery. It doesn't prevent him from arranging for murder. What does it mean? And while we're at it, why does the Bible so feature flawed heroes? I mean, why in a culture where we've got this litmus test, if you're not perfect, your statue must come down? Why does the Bible in turn go, wait a minute? Any statue of anybody will be of imperfect people. I'm not necessarily trying to speak politically, though I realize that's what I'm doing, but here's my caution. To me, what's concerning is the Bible has a way of saying the difference between good and bad is this engagement, perhaps. I'm all for tearing down a statue because the person was imperfect, but to me, the refrain that follows that should be, and therefore, if you're going to raise one for me, you'll have to tear that one down too, because I too am imperfect. What if David is a hero in the text, like lots of heroes, not because he was perfect, but because he was repentant? And because he did at times return to Christ and go, whoa, or to God in his case and go, whoa. What if he is an exemplar of the road to character in the sense that he named his stuff? You know, there's a story in Jesus' gospel that I think is an example of this. You'll have to decide. But in Luke 10, Jesus seems to show up at some of his closest friends' house. And I just want to read this story. Now, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village and where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by many tasks, so she came to him and asked, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you're worried and distracted by many things. There's need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. Here's my question to myself, and if it's relevant for you, great. Does the Jesus that I follow, is he at times that direct with me? Does he always just agree with me, or does he at times call me out from my own Adam 2 failures? Like, what if this story represents on some level that these people lived in a culture that at times was judgmental, but notice the friendship, where one could say to another, like, hey, I think you missed the boat on this one. I think you're morally out of line on this one. And what would be the value of such a culture? See, this brings me back to COVID. Suddenly, I think we're all aware that fundamentally, you're stuck with yourself. I'm stuck with myself. The gift we have to offer may be your business, and it may be your trade, but you could lose that in a second. What if the story is about a God who, this isn't about getting through life, but about being transformed into his kinds of people? For what? I can't claim to understand, but for something. I remember my friend Fred said to me years ago, and I don't think I was particularly successful with this as a parent, but his challenge was, as parents, we need to be very careful. Because when our child wins a game, when they make a team, we'll buy them ice cream and pizza and celebrate like crazy. When they tell us a story of a time where they acknowledged a lie, we barely even acknowledge it. I think that's part of what we're trying to get at with the Bob story that we showed at the beginning. What happens if we become more aware of our Adam 2 self? And I guess here would be my question, and maybe the jumping off point. What is that for you? Like, what's the chief moral fault that you deal with? What some would call, what's the dominant sin that you've been fighting for as long as you can remember? And see, here's where I think this is a gift. I've been deciding for a long time, do I deal with anxiety or control or fear, or what is it? And what you quickly realize is, man, they're all kind of the same thing. I don't think my moral issues have as much variety as I think. I think, we're going to explore this a little bit more, I think the core one is actually kind of courage, a failure to be courageous. What's the chief moral flaw for you? And would there be value, not in beating yourself up repeatedly, but in returning to Christ by just acknowledging like, yeah, here it is, and there it was again, and there it was again. I mean, this is really the practice of confession as I'm learning about it. For me, I can go back to when I was 5 years old. I'm old enough that kindergarten wasn't in public schools. I went to some lady's house where a group of kids got dropped off, and it was a good experience. Next to the house was a kid named Riley. He lived there. I can still remember like it was yesterday when the first time I was invited to spend the night at Riley's house. The sun must have set, it was probably 8 o'clock or something, and I started to feel what I now know was homesickness. I can still feel the panic. I can still see 5-year-old me on the phone in Riley's basement in his bedroom, calling home and asking my mom to come get me, which she did. And I'm not faulting her for that in any way. But I can see in there's a theme that I can follow through my entire life. I'm not speaking for everyone. I'm less and less convinced that my anxiety is a chemical thing. I think it's a moral thing. I think I've been prone to choose easy over hard for as long as I can remember. I think I hate to suffer. I caught myself recently saying, I'd rather die in an airplane crash than be stuck on a chairlift for 3 hours. And then I thought, that's ridiculous. But I still think I would. But there was this sense of like, wait a minute, you have a wife and kids, and like, what does that say? What's the chief moral vice that you deal with? And what if the story is not a God who loves you when you deal with that, but a God who loves you, and because he loves you, that compels you to deal with that? That we don't earn God's love. We so bask in God's love that out of respect to God, we go, okay, Lord, light, city on a hill, beacon, kingdom bringers, dad, mom, coworker, friend. Okay, Lord, for everyone else, see, this is my thing. I don't think morality and personal morality is ultimately about you. I think it's about the people that we serve, people that we marry, that we date, that we coach, that we play games with. Ultimately, it's the one gift that we have control over that we can give to those around us. So what might that be for you? And would you be willing to spend the next 4 or 5 weeks just really leaning in? Maybe making that a part of therapy sessions or conversations with friends or small groups or whatever that looks like for you. But to really lean in and go, Lord, this is kind of freeing. I don't think I have 30 problems. I just have one giant problem. And remember, the gospel is like God loved you before the cross. The cross is God doing business with evil and other things. In some ways I understand, in some ways I don't. But it's not God being talked into loving you. It's God dealing with something bigger than ourselves and enabling you to step into who he calls you to be. And whether you're going to start doing that for the first time this month or you've been trying to do it for 20 years, it's fun to do that together. Let me pray. God, thanks, Lord, for guys like David Brooks who put new spins on what are thousands of years old ideas. And God, thanks for Jesus and the story of character that his tells. It just seems so clear that his frustrations were rarely with people getting religion wrong and mostly with people neglecting the core of their person. So Jesus, I pray for my friends in this room that to whatever extent that they're compelled by you and ideally by your Spirit to really pay attention to what's the deal, that you would come alongside and encourage them in that. We love you, God. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.